There you go. Thanks. So I've already talked about our mission. The vision really is to solve problems that affect two or more parts of the supply chain. And that's an important distinction, both to me and to the organization. There are plenty of organizations that represent a specific segment, and those are important resources for the industry. Our job is to address problems, points of friction, and opportunities that, whether it's publishers talking to distributors, distributors dealing with retailers, et cetera. The core topic areas that we organize our committees around, metadata rights, supply chain, subject codes, and workflow, are all more than one part of the industry. And in many cases, they're all parts of the industry. And we break that down into 4 core objectives. We work on information, essentially serving as an information hub for the book business, standards and best practices, conducting research that informs the industry, and inclusion, which is specifically around diversity, equity, inclusion across multiple segments of the supply chain. The thing to keep in mind is that at least 2 of them are directly touch upon data and tech stacks. So when we talk about standards, the specific language that we use is to foster the development, refinement, and use of standards that deliver specific outcomes, improve revenue, promote product visibility, reduce costs, or ensure transparency. Those are kind of the filters for which the projects that we undertake are measured. Similarly, when it comes to research, we're looking to shape the conversation about the current state and future of book publishing by studying and communicating about emerging topics, issues, and trends. And certainly the structure, both the tech and the data structure of the industry when it comes to communicating around metadata rights and supply chain. We've had a lot of conversations in this forum about forecasting, as an example. Is a significant opportunity for us. So the filters that we use and will continue to use when we think about transforming supply chain communication are specifically those that are outlined in the objectives, transparency, product visibility, improved revenue, and reduce cost. And ultimately fostering in a variety of different ways, including research, a coherent discussion about the issues that affect our business. I think that's where BISG adds its value. There are a lot of good things that we do under our 3 strategies, which are convening, amplifying, and solving problems. But the core of it really is building awareness of opportunities that the industry could take advantage of, and then laying out the business case on things like transparency, visibility, revenue, expense that would make sense for us going forward. So that's why we're tackling this. I mentioned at the outset, we started this as a conversation at our annual meeting. There were 2 different panels, one on data ecosystem that was led by Claire Holloway, who's on this call. She's with OCLC and is also our metadata committee chair. And it included Chris Kleeman, who's our rights committee chair, and Dan Lubart from iBite Solutions, which does a lot of work in managing metadata across the industry for a variety of clients. And then on the tech stack, Krista Colson from the University of Chicago Press, who chairs our workflow committee, talked with Jens Klingelhofer at Bookwire and Joe Karaganis at the Open Syllabus Project about the kinds of problems that they're having. Bookwire is a digital asset, digital content distributor, particularly in the ebook space. And Joe has been doing a lot of work to try and collect information about what books are published and how they're used in higher education. And they talk openly about the challenges that they're facing interacting with publishers whose systems are often legacy in nature. So that's where it kind of got going. The theory behind it, so I have 2 different definitions for you here. These are the ones that we present at the annual. So when somebody was looking for a definition of, sorry, I'm going to go back a moment. Looking for a definition of what is a data ecosystem. The formal definition is a complex environment of codependent actors and networks that perform and contribute to data generation, data collection, data transfer analysis, and data quality. When we think about metadata, the applications are pretty clear. When we think about forecasting, though, I think the applications are equally clear. We just don't have in both cases, we don't have good solutions in place for them. So I think that what we're trying to think about is how does work get done across the industry, not just how do metadata get created within a publisher, or how does it get used within a distributor, but how does it move across the industry? And is it interoperable? Is it readily managed? Does it contribute to transparency across the industry? Those are the kinds of things we're trying to answer. We put together for the annual 2 charts. This is the first of them on components of, in this case, a data ecosystem. So we did it by segment, and we could also include, and it's an important part of the industry partners, because they operate in a variety of different ways across multiple players within the industry. But we chose, both for simplicity and clarity in a public setting, to just talk about publishers, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and libraries. These are all organizations that are part of BISG today, and they're also doing things in a variety of different ways. So you see the data ecosystem within the publisher space involves bibliographic, marketing, and commerce metadata. But you'll also see for libraries, they've got bibliographic metadata. It's not the same bibliographic metadata. And so there is a challenge in both how that moves across the industry and then how it's interpreted by various retailers, distributors, and libraries. Manufacturers typically look for things like printed quantity or carton quantity, manufacturing specifications. Distributors will look at inventory and stock information, which is certainly of interest to publishers, but it's typically maintained at the distributor level. And even if you're self-distributed, it's a separate function within the publishing house. Shipping information and returns. Retailers, you see repositories of sales data, orders, returns, and other information. And then in the library space, you've got things like circulation and holdings data, which is quite interesting, actually, if you're trying to figure out how the velocity of a book and the interest for a book. Generally hard to get at. It's important information, but not collated or brought together in a timely basis, unlike sales data, which also has its challenges. You've got bibliographic metadata, as I alluded to, but different from what a publisher provides. And then consumption by business model. Increasingly, the digital lending models in particular have essentially expanded over time. It's harder and harder to figure out what licenses are sold and what books are sold under different business models, except by doing that analysis by hand. The publishers are getting some of that information back, often through an intermediary operating as a distributor in that space. But it's hard to interpret and time consuming and data and labor intensive. So these are not so much the problems, but these are just examples of the kinds of different components across the ecosystem that we feel we could have an opportunity to bring together. So some of the data issues that we face today, and these are the first several are really metadata related. The last couple are forecasting related, and there are more. And I'd love to hear, as people kind of think through this today, when we go to the discussion, what other things are on that list for you that we're missing, or at least haven't presented today. So the first is flavors of Onyx. I mean, it's a pretty well understood problem within the U.S. market. Each recipient has its own variety of Onyx that it wants to receive. Sometimes the variants are small, sometimes they're larger than smaller, but they all require some degree of customization for their use. And we have a number of intermediaries that have kind of adopted the ability to serve those variants over time. The problem is not that we can't get the variants out, which was kind of the early focus, probably in the early 2010s, particularly as we tried to move to Onyx 3, but rather that we're not able to look across the ecosystem to truly understand what's happening. An example that we wanted to find out what the uptake was for List 196, which is declarations of accessibility in metadata. It's not the only way that that accessibility information is conveyed. It also can be included in the file itself. But we wanted to look across the industry and say how many publishers or what share of books or both are currently providing metadata declarations around accessibility and in what areas. An impossible question to answer in the US market. You can't go anywhere. You could survey lots of different publishers, but BookNet Canada can do that analysis in under an hour because it has a single repository of English language titles in the Canadian marketplace. That those essentially separations or and distinctions across different parts of the industry also make it difficult to check metadata quality. Many publishers have good partners, metadata aggregators and the like who are providing feedback to them directly, but there's no timely feedback in the supply chain. When we studied this issue last in 2012, the metadata standard for feedback and timely reporting of errors was pretty clear, but it's never followed except in the breach. And that also makes it harder to actually get to the point where we're able to link cause and effect. I mean, if you're not hearing directly, this is broken, but rather somebody fixed it or they didn't post your data, you're chasing a problem that you don't know the source, and it's really difficult to fix. The other problem, and I'll show an illustration of this in a moment, we have multiple versions of competing metadata in the marketplace because we're sending files rather than working from single repositories of record. There's a tremendous amount of information that could be changed and is changed by folks who don't agree with whether it's page count or subtitle, etc. Sometimes the changes are fully valid, but there's no feedback mechanism and there's no way to intervene on that. I talked a little bit about the inability to query use of metadata elements. A couple of examples that I want to do that are not metadata specific. One is manufacturing specifications. These are all sidecar at the moment. We don't have a good mechanism, and it's a problem for us, particularly as we start to try and figure out what forecasting looks like, because forecasting isn't just we have this many copies and we can aggregate it, the size, the page count, etc. Every book is different, and so capacity is very much determined by what you want to produce. So understanding both what you have and when you want to do it, or for that matter, when you have to move things, where it's going to move in the supply chain. We don't have a mechanism for that except by intervention at the level of the production department within a particular publisher and the planning department by various names at a printer. So I think there are plenty more, but these are just examples of a lack of connection across the industry that forces us to do two things. One is do a lot more manual labor to get the data that we need and fix it. And there's a lack of transparency for us to understand what's actually happening. And sometimes it just blocks us from doing things that we should be doing, but certainly it's hard to take advantage of opportunities. The two examples I wanted to give, this is a chart. These next two charts are actually taken from a 2012 BISG research project that we did. And this diagram represents how supply chain participants, particularly publishers, thought the market worked, which is essentially that metadata went out, there was a feedback mechanism that came back. This chart captures the vendors that were in place at the time. I didn't try to change it or update it. This actually is closer. It's also drawn from the 2012 research project, but it's closer to what actually happens is at the time, and I think it's even more so now. There was increasing complexity in how the market worked. And there was the project itself was to try and identify uses, modifications, and updates to existing metadata, meaning what happens to metadata once it leaves the publishing house? Does it ever get changed? Does the change get fed back? The answer was yes, it absolutely gets changed, and the answer is probably very unlikely that you'd ever hear about it. So you wind up chasing changed metadata throughout the supply chain. The other question asked was, how often do updates, particularly after publication date, get pushed through in the supply chain? And the answer was surprisingly low, and it varied by by recipient. So there were lots of different players, lots of different versions of metadata, and not a really good system for getting, that one source of truth into the marketplace. That was true in 2012. It's still true today. I don't think anyone finds that this problem is solved, and that concerns us a lot because it's been a long time that we've been substantially using. It's 20 years, 25 years really of Onyx. And we're still chasing this in a way that makes it hard to get things to be A, right, and B, fixed when they're not right. Taking a deep breath. So the second session that we had at the annual was on tech stack, and you can combine these two and think about tech and data together. It's certainly how problems are going to get solved, but we kind of separated it to have two different discussions at the annual. At that point, we were talking about the tech stack as a set of technologies that's used to deliver a desired result. And it could include programming languages, frameworks, databases, front end and back end, transfers and APIs. I think that the key thing here is that it's an integrated approach. We tend to think about it as a tech stack within a company. And I've been trying to think about it as tech stack within the industry. And how would we want to organize our technology so that we can deliver better results for essentially a rising tide across the supply chain. And we did a similar diagram for tech stacks. That was the one I kind of walked you through a few minutes ago with respect to data and the data ecosystem. So the kinds of things that you see on a publisher side or product databases, title management systems, not the formal title management that Firebrand sells, but just title management in general, ERP and transaction systems. Manufacturers are going to have EDI and production planning systems. That's kind of how they run their business. Distributors will do things like WMSs, warehouse management, distribution management, and logistics. They'll also have ERP and transaction systems because it's the nature of that business. Retailers are going to have a variety of different implementations of point of sale systems. Any one retailer might have one, but there are dozens in the marketplace. Order management systems and financial systems are really important as well. And on the library side, you've got library management systems, which are order management systems that they've got to order books. They sometimes do that directly, more often through the wholesalers or other vendors that they're working with directly. They also have content platforms because they've got a host. Sometimes that's integrated with LMSs, other times not. But there's a lot of different moving parts that aren't necessarily that well coordinated. So the challenges we see with the existing tech stack, part of this is that, and this isn't unique to book publishing, but they're based in legacy systems. Some of them date back to the 80s and 90s when we were trying to solve this problem, particularly for the first growth of larger big box format stores like Borders and Barnes and Noble. They're often custom integrations with aspects of their own ERP solutions. So if you've got a big a legacy system and a publisher that's tied into an ERP solution that they had to kind of build the wires in some way, shape, or form, it's really sticky and hard to change. I mean, you can't just say, oh, let's get to a new system. You have to recognize that it's directly tied to how they do order processing and a variety of other things. That means that they're difficult to evolve. And a lot of the new use cases, this is what we heard clearly from Jens Klingelhofer, Bookwire, and Joe Caragana's Open Syllabus. Every time they tried to do something, they'd have to figure out a one-off solution for that particular publisher if they wanted to get information. That makes interoperability elusive at best. And the repositories that we do have are proprietary, or they're not really fully deployed. And that reduces transparency, and then ultimately it limits how much industry-wide understanding we have. I'm not trying to be negative. I mean, the business works, but I don't think it works as well as it could. And I'm concerned, and I think BISG is concerned, that it may not work as well as it needs to going forward. And there are probably more examples, and we can kick those around in the conversation. And then this last piece is just, what could we change? And this is drawn from a slide that I used in a section. We had a chance at the end of the morning at the annual meeting to talk about an example. BookNet Canada was one, and Batch, the payments clearinghouse, was a second. And as an introduction to that, I offered that, what kinds of things could we do differently? One idea is metadata repositories of record. I think we understand distributors of record as a vehicle for managing distribution within the marketplace. But there's no single place to go for metadata repositories. BISG, I don't think reasonably can solve that role. We can't become BookNet Canada. There are lots of other players already in that space, but I think we can create standards and federate the repositories so the queries become much more manageable, particularly through the use of APIs. I think payment clearinghouses, particularly for multiple publishers and multiple booksellers, is an approach that worked really well in the UK. They've struggled to implement it. The same company, Batch, in the US. There are limitations. It's not a trivial exercise, but it's an opportunity. Batch doesn't just do payments; it also essentially automates core agreements about returns. And while the UK agreements around returns may not mimic what we want to do in the US, the fact is that automating that process for the things that we do agree on is doable. And I think it's a significant opportunity for us. Even as returns are down, the processing work is still somewhere between 10 and 20% of the marketplace. Real-time data exchange, which just is a pipe dream right now, book publishing marketplace, could be a really important piece of the puzzle. Some folks have built systems that get us that, they get themselves that information, but we don't have it for the industry. And then the last piece, and this kind of touches upon the forecasting examples they used with the data ecosystem, the opportunity to integrate other parts of the supply chain over things like paper availability, printing capacity, units printed, units sold, returns by genre, market size, and more it's just an intelligence opportunity that, to the extent that the biggest publishers have it right now, I think it could be done better. And I think it also could improve the industry as a whole if we're able to make that functionality available more broadly than just the largest players. So that's kind of a whirlwind walk, but
well, thank you.
Take questions.
So I've been live streaming questions over in the chat as they occur to me as you were talking, Brian. Let me encourage anybody else to put their thoughts or questions in the chat, and I'll just start going down the list, and we'll answer them or we'll address them.
Thanks.
Let's see. So the first question I had was particularly up in the discussion about data ecosystem. It seemed like that focus was all on the data, but in reality, that data exists as a means to an end. So e-commerce or commerce or shipments or manufacturing or what have you. Shouldn't we be focused on the process side and making sure that the processes are right?
Yeah, well, it's not either or. I think the structure of the data plays a role in what you're practically able to do with process. I mean, the workflow solution, it's process technology or tools and organizational structure who's engaged in using it. So I do think the process base plays a significant role, but if I stay with that accessibility example, if what we're trying to do is increase the amount of information available about a particular book, a digital copy of a book, and the features that characterize its accessibility, if we're not able to tell where we are, not just on a given book, but across either a publisher, an imprint, or an industry, it's really hard to know where to go to work on making it better. And I think that information right now is largely obtained by survey, casual conversation, and informal inquiry. That's the kind of thing I'd want to change. Having a process to make sure that you get that information in place and better. If the problem is that publishers aren't providing it, then there's a place to go. If the problem is that recipients aren't featuring it, there's a different process and a different place to go.
Well, so I'm actually thinking that the pairing that you did of the tech stack and the data stack are really complementary here. So the tech stack is really around the process and how you get things done. So how do you take orders? How do you bill? How do you do all that sort of stuff? And then the data stack resides and enables that tech stack or the processes to happen. So it's not accidental that that you've got both of these together.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I misjudged your question. You're right, absolutely. And we broke it apart in the annual and talked about data and tech separately because we wanted to dedicate the better part of 90 minutes to that part of the conversation, which is not a lot when you're trying to sort through the various parts of the industry, but it was a way to kind of break it down into two different panels. But it is, I thought the entire morning where we talked about forecasting first, it was a panel that Ken, that you moderated, then talked about data stack, tech stack, and examples of what other marketplaces, in this case, Canada and the UK, had done. Was part of a more or less seamless story that we were trying to change the supply chain and how it works, as opposed to trying to improve how a publisher segment works or distributor segment works. We're trying to figure out what's the best exchange to be able to have anybody in the supply chain get the information they need to do their job better, to run their businesses better.
And I noticed the focus here was primarily on the outbound flow from publishers. But you did add a few pieces about the inbound flow, so the specifications. I don't know whether you mentioned the files that are coming in, but there used to be a standard called XBits, and I don't even know what happened to it, but that was like the EDI standard for manufacturing.
Yes, it's still there, Ken. This is Phil
Is it?
Madden's from Meshed. Yes, we use it. We're
Oh,
using
very
it.
good.
Yeah, we started using it when it first came out because we were building a new system, and we're still using it. But I don't know anybody else who is. And
Yeah, I think McGraw might be.
might be. I think that's a key to this, is because in order to have this communication, you have to have people using standards. Otherwise, you can't talk to each other. And I think that's one of the issues, because everyone works differently and they might be capturing their data differently. And then you have to figure out how to, if there's a middleware that's going to translate that, that's fine. But then it gets very complicated. But XBits, I think XBits has worked very well for us over the years. It's really has simplified things. So I was hoping that, we'd bring that up and maybe try to give it more life. It was, it's based on PappyNet and when it first came out. But I don't know how many vendors are accepting it. I think, it started with the covers and now we're using it for books. Donnelly was using it. We were using it with Donnelly. And we're still using it with them, whatever they're called now. And, but it just was never accepted. And I always wondered why it wasn't, because it is a very good and a good way of doing that. And it makes even in working internally a lot better, because it use in our system and then we don't have to train anybody. We know that, when people come in and they can just put the stuff in their PO system and it just goes out to the vendor and it's fine. It works.
It's interesting. So you're viewing it as a way to organize that information between yourselves and the printers, and you could almost implement it in EDI, which was originally designed for, or via API and web services as technology moves forward. But it's the structure of the data.
Right. In fact, we built it into the title management system, so we could use it, which was not easy to do, but we did get it to work. So, in the old days, we would just send a PO to the vendor, and the vendor would actually do everything. It would just say print 15,000 books, and here's the paper to use. But now we have all of our specs. We have all of our specs. very detailed in our system to send out, and we know exactly what we're doing. We know exactly what they're doing, and if they have a problem, we know how to track it down. So that's a type of thing. If you can use a standard like that, I think it works for everybody. I just think it makes things easier.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've been experiencing some difficulties myself recently about with specs that were not adequately transmitted to a vendor and resulted in many books being printed with the wrong specifications. So good fun there.
Yes.
So
Just, I was going to add that it ties into pricing as well. I know when I was at Pearson, they were really pushing to automate the pricing as much as possible, not get manual quotes. So I think that's another benefit on both sides, because it's so time consuming to either generate the quotes or enter that information on the POs.
Yeah, and when it's being transmitted digitally, people on the other side don't have to put it into their system. It just goes in there. There should be far less mistakes or typos on the orders that are coming in. Which is just, that's the whole theory behind Onyx too. It's the same thing, or any digital transmission. So
speaking of standards, I imagine there have to be international standards on data interchange and data management and data quality management and all. Is that something that might be leverageable in BISG's activities? Does anybody know of any of those standards? There's got to be an ISO standard on this stuff.
Well, we've
All right.
got, no, I sorry, I was waiting for Phil to weigh in, because it's a topic that he cares a lot about. I mean, in terms of, we've got a survey in the field right now to try and understand what the level of sophistication with respect to metadata training and organization is. And I think we could do a lot more. I think the change that I'm proposing here, and that we're committed to try and suss out over the next couple of 3 years, is broad enough so that it's going to require a lot of different conversations of this sort. So it's not just how publishers handle metadata, but really, Rebecca Burgoyne asked in the chat of experts, how do you do it? And do you have to be a shed to do it? Can it be somebody smaller? I mean, XBits is an interesting implementation of the standard. It never really got much uptake beyond what's now Lakeside Press.
Right.
And it's been an effective implementation for them. But if other printers don't use it, unless you're willing to convert every one of your printers and or only use Lakeside, you're in a kind of a bad spot. But it did have its origins with the what was then the Graphic Communications Association, and then the trying to remember the magazine, Idea Alliance. Idea Alliance.
It was Carl Graphics, I think, who also picked it up, or it might have been Jaguar. It was one of the jacket printers that picked it up first, and they brought it to us. And that's how we got involved in it. It's a huge standard. I mean, you can imagine, you have every thing that you can do to create a book is in that standard. And I think that's what scared a lot of people, because it is so broad. I mean, I think my problem and why we're doing this is to see how people think of data. I don't know that we take data seriously enough, because there's always somebody, because, if you're a big publisher, you do it because you have to keep your business running. But smaller publishers, there are other things to worry about. And a lot of the smaller publishers think, well, my distributor's going to do this. Or if I have a lot of them don't even have title management systems, which, is another issue, because they're not storing the data in a standard way. So, and that just blocks everything up down the line. I think it's better now. I think there are more people who are doing title management. I think the distributors are doing better with that. They're getting more serious about it, but it's also a priority. Where are you going to put your money? None of these things are cheap. None of these things are, they all take work. A lot of it is because of legacy systems, because legacy systems just aren't up to date on what they can do and what they can provide. We had that problem with our our Onyx system. That's why we moved to a title management system that can do Onyx. And those are all big
It seems
projects.
it seems to me like one place that BISG could play a role is to take a reference architecture for each of the players and the reference um, links between the different systems in the supply chain, and then go one by one and say, here's how you would do this, and here's what the standard would be. And then over time, as people are investing in new systems or making adjustments to their current systems, they could at least not have to reinvent the wheel and be implementing something in the right ultimate direction.
Yeah, I think that is how it's. I mean, there's more
I think that's
nuance.
what's happening. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think that
that's a
there
slow
has to be.
process.
It is. Yeah, I mean, there's the thing we lack, and I don't think I would not claim today's conversation as or presentation as a picture of it, but we lack a vision of how it would work because, and the vision has to be tied to those reference architectures that generally people are a little bit unlikely to tell you. It's publishers may be a little bit more open, but a lot of the shared resources, the distributor and retailer community, they compete on these systems. So kind of going under the hood and trying to figure out what the links should be is going to take work. And that's work that I think is just beginning.
David
I'd like to-
Aldridge, go ahead.
I was just going to make a somewhat facetious comment based on something that Phil said about, why aren't people using data? I think one big element of it is that people's eyes glaze over when they think about the concept of data. And it's like, wait, we were all English majors, right? And it's information, people. And it's information that's communicated in a very consistent way to disambiguate the information. But people just don't grasp that. So the data is very, very efficient information, and then data done in a standards way is the most effective way possible. It seems like such a no-brainer, but you're right. People don't get it.
I don't, Bill. I don't think it's the data. I think it's the systems and getting the data into a system.
Maybe that's it.
That's what people push back on, because the more standardized you're going to get, the more granular you're going to get to the data to get the best data, the more complex the systems you're going to get, and it takes longer to do that.
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of look where I am, a lot of the data starts with editorial systems. This is not why they got to be into publishing. They wanted to be editors. And again, a lot of them may not see the big picture yet. A lot may, but they're very busy and they've got a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I think data should be, if you think about it, if you have in your other systems, in your financial systems, in your order cash systems and things like that, you wouldn't put somebody who just started working in an industry in charge of that data. Certainly, not on your royalties, not on that things, but we do that with the first title metadata, which is what flows, which is the start of everything.
I completely agree with that, Phil. And the other thing is that content creators are not metadata managers. No. They don't understand how metadata works, and they don't understand how it's supposed to be structured. And what we see with content creators creating metadata is that they get creative. They want the words that associate with what they feel that they are creating as a part of the content development process. And so it becomes less about a technical communication between systems, which is what we need, and more about a person's feelings about what they're communicating with the content that they're working with.
Right. That's what I meant by saying we don't take data seriously enough, because it's not in the hands of people when it starts. Maybe it should be in other hands. It should be in a more expert hands when it's starting. And if you start that way, then you don't have these problems down the line with bad data.
Yeah, if you get it right, it makes the processes easier, right?
Right.
Not harder, easier.
So David Aldridge asks, is Onyx Block 8 production detail potential alternative or equivalent to XBits? Does anybody know?
Yeah, I mean, editor was pretty careful to not try and make it a competitor to XBits because we don't want to be in the dueling standard space. The Block 8 was kind of built to address print on demand and audiobook. It could evolve and there are certain significant advantages to kind of having one system to cover all production metadata. But the reality right now is that its use case is limited to on demand and audiobook.
So Claire mentions that metadata.com puts out a best practices for metadata senders and receivers, large document. Claire, do you want to tell us any more about that?
Metadata committee. Sorry.
Oh, committee.
I just was typing quickly. I was taking advantage. I was trying to type a lot while the point was still being made, and so abbreviated. But no, the metadata committee is putting out. We're actively revising right now the best practices document for metadata senders and receivers, which is greater than Onyx. Editor puts out all the specification, but metadata is greater than Onyx. And to Brian's point, we are making it more accessible in as many ways as we possibly can. But yeah, it is such a huge undertaking just to do that for one small aspect of what we're talking about today. It's a worthy undertaking, and I'm glad that we're doing it. But as I think about how the many other aspects that we're talking about today that could benefit from that work, it's a huge task.
Now, is that mostly focused on product, like product master data, or is there customer master and order and shipment and all the rest of the stuff in there? Or is it product master?
Yep.
Product. Okay.
Yep. Just so really, yeah, it's a very small window with a lot of effort behind it.
I'd always viewed the byproducts of the product development process, or byproducts, the co-deliverables, if you will, would be the content itself, like the print masters that are going out to printers, the specifications, the marketing metadata, all of that stuff. And that product process isn't finished until it's all done. But I think, Phil, you were saying that maybe not everybody, or maybe it was Rachel, not everybody's thinking of it that way. They're thinking of it being finished when the product's finished.
Some do. I mean, that was part of the survey that we did, and we're going to look at that. We asked them, how do you keep maintaining your data after the book is published? At PASS, when it goes out on Onyx the first time, you keep updating it. Some do and some don't. Or, it's just for the first printing, or it's just for the first year, and then they don't bother doing it for the backlist, which is actually very important to keep doing it. And I think that's the kind of thing we want to see, so then we can come up with some, real basic recommendations to put out there. When we see it, and some of it is just you only have so many people and so much time, so some of it is resources. But I think to know how important that is, I think something we want to do.
I think that point of resources is really important on that front, Phil. And also what you were saying earlier ties into this as well, that publishers are still heavily focused on let's publish books. We have this goal of getting these books published. That's our job. And I think some of this is just a continuation of kind of where we've been in publishing for the last 100 years, even, that we haven't adapted to some of the changes that have come as a result of digital transformation, and the need for better data quality management internally, better data systems, and actually enacting systems like title management systems, and also being willing and able to go back to those old backlist titles, and knowing that long tail has not only gotten longer, it's gotten bigger, it's gotten thicker, and there's actually potentially sales left on the table if you don't have better data management for those older titles. So this is all kind of, I think, tied into the question of internally within a publisher, how much do you care, and how much do you even know to care about your data, not just for the metadata itself, but all the types of data that you as a publisher manage and maintain.
Yeah, I can only talk for trade publishers. That's all I know. But a lot of it is cultural. Trade publishing is still very much a feudal system in
Is that
many
the
ways.
FUTILE or FEU?
Either way, it's fine. Either way works. I mean, you have these apprentices with editorial assistants and things like that, and you have to start at this bottom and serve your time to get in there, and that's been going on forever. And
So
it's a lot different.
Kathy, you asked a question about whether any publishers follow data governance protocols. Is that something official, or what do you mean by that?
It's been proposed within PUP. I don't know the origin of the term, but apparently it goes far beyond publishing. It's a way of managing data within an organization that has been proposed that we look at.
I think Riley might have been looking at that. Mark, do you remember?
Yeah, they do have a data governance committee or group there. So it covers a lot of things, obviously more than supply chain, but a lot of it had to do with they would pick up certain attributes or data points that they would try to define and control. That was kind of the main my intersection with that. And it was a small group, so they could only do so much. But just trying to kind of rein in these terms for one thing, and then maybe restrict the set of values, those kind of things. So I've heard of it, well, inside and outside of publishing. Wiley's the only place I ran into it though, but yeah, they do have a department there.
I feel like where the data governance and the culture intersect are, I've worked at places that only a small number of people control the outward bound data. And basically what is entered by editorial and production is scrubbed by the small group before it exits. And now where I work, it's been very democratized. I mean, there's pros and cons to both ways.
And if
Okay,
I could, before you finish, the one thing I was going to say, you'd asked me about two-way communication, and experts was your example, and the conversation kind of evolved from there. I'd like to come back to it just for a minute, because there are, and beyond experts, there's editex, which is the ability to give publishers and retailers specifically, but the ability to communicate information in two-way exchanges, increasingly tied to the way that metadata is sent out. So if you go out and you describe 24 business models for digital lending, that the reporting can come back using XML and XBits in a way that can be tied in directly to a system. That information right now comes largely through spreadsheets that are not normalized, require a lot of significant intervention. That's a revamp of the system, and it would require development of XBits. of editex. But I mean, that development doesn't occur because no one's asking for it. And that it's certainly doable in a relatively short period of time if we wanted to create that kind of communication.
Isn't that an editor standard, Brian?
Editex is an editor standard.
Yeah.
And it's increasingly aligned. Their code list is increasingly aligned with that for Onyx, which means that stuff goes out in one code list, then stuff can come back using the same code list.
I think one of the big issues is when you need one of these standards, you need it now, and you don't have a year or two to wait for it to be developed. So some visionary book industry organization really needs to take this on and get out there in front of all the people having needs for it.
Yeah, that's what we're trying. I mean, one of the reasons that Dan Lubart was a critical addition to the panel that Claire moderated at the annual meeting is that Dan does this kind of work every day. And the question I didn't ask him from the floor, but he's very able to answer is, why would you talk about this? Because your business model is built upon, effectively filling in the gaps between publishers and retailers. And his answer, I don't want to paraphrase him inappropriately, but his answer was fundamental. He wants to see the industry do better. And, he'll find another way to make money.
Which is a really good way to maybe end the session today, since we're running out of time here. Any last points anybody would like to make?
I just add Marcus thrown in just in the chat just now, a thing about data governance that might be useful for folks interested in the topic. And I want to say thank you. I mean, I anticipated that this would be about a 40-minute session today, given the depth of the topic, but clearly it's resonated. We're going to keep working on it. I don't know the exact calendar for when we'll come back to it, but it won't be that long.